Hello, and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that doesn't have a joke this time, because what we're doing is we're going through last year's predictions and seeing where we fell. So I guess we're going to go straight on into that. There's no news here. It's a slow time of year anyway. I mean, I'm sure there has been some news, hasn't there, Rob? But
The news is constant, but just for us this year, they've paused it for a couple of weeks so we can release this podcast, which is very nice. Thank you, news.
Yes, we'll just ignore the fact that Liz Truss's honours list has finally gone through and all that kind of stuff. And just head on into our main story, which is looking at last year's predictions. So we normally split these by party, and then we also deal with our kind of broad topics outside of the UK, broad topic. Anyway, we're starting with the Tories because they're in power. So we predicted last year, I believe, there would be no general election that year.
Yeah, and, mark one up for us for making super easy predictions and getting them right. There was no general election this year. I mean, not to jump ahead to our predictions for next year, but there's got to be one, hasn't there? So, again, that'll be a very lame prediction from us. But
it's nice to have a few softball predictions.
Yeah, exactly. No, I do think that it was, given the chaos that we had last year, like we have had, well done 2023, we have had one prime minister rather than three. So that is a success in its own right. Well done, Conservative Party. And there was maybe a bit of a feeling that if Rishi Sunak had a bump, or if suddenly he was, the next... Well, I was about to say if he was the next Manchester United, but I think he is the next Manchester United because they're doing really poorly and he's doing really poorly. If he was the next Manchester City, maybe all of a sudden that he looked really good and he turned the Conservative Party's fortune round, maybe that would be the time for them to strike and hold a general election. But there has been, if you pay attention to our episodely poll updates, there's been no predictable bump for them, has there? There's been no good time to hold a general election. They've
been consistently 15 to 20 points behind in the polls. So I think they're possibly stable, but not necessarily strong at the moment.
Yes.
To reference back to yet another slogan that has not panned out for the Conservative Party. So our other prediction was that, well, I guess is kind of contingent on the idea that there would be a general election, but still holds that Rishi would be the leader up until the next general election. Well, as far as last year goes, we're still correct on that score.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't one and he hasn't gone.
Yeah, no, I had a listen to last year's podcast in prep for this one, and I said there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that you've got the chaos that would ensue if you had yet another leader in between general elections. If they got rid of Rishi Sunak, they would have had both Truss and Rishi and Boris in power and somebody else. So they would have had 2 to 3 changes of leadership without a general election, which raises huge question marks about, democracy and in its role and how it picks the leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of the nation. Secondly, I said that it was because there was a extreme lack of talent within the Conservative Party. I didn't see another obvious successor. I didn't see the rise of Suella Braverman within the Conservative Party. And I stick by that prediction. I don't think she's risen at all.
I think there was a brief moment where we thought, oh, maybe, but yes.
Yeah,
yes.
No, she is trying to rise, but she's doing it in the same way. And I've spoken about this in previous ones, so apologies if I'm repeating myself. But how Liz Truss was kind of forced into the limelight. I felt people were like, oh, she's a respected name. We can dress her up as Thatcher. Everybody will think that she's Thatcher and she'll win. And she did win, but was very, very bad at it. Yeah. I think, when I talk about lack of talent, that's what I would worry if Suella was to get to the forefront of the party. But no, I think any respective leadership challenges to Rishi, they are firmly looking at what happens after the next general election and if they can direct the Conservatives to a new direction, because if the polls are to be believed, they'll need a new direction if they're to try and get back any voters.
And I think we've said it before, 13 years in power, there's only so much they can do to convince people that all these problems are not their fault.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that leads on to our next point quite well. We were talking about possible Conservative strategies for the year 2023.
We essentially they have to hope that things go away. Such in fact, when did he make the 5 pledges? Was that after we recorded the predictions, or was that just before?
It might be just before. It was very early on in his premiership. Truss left October, 2022?
October or very early November.
Yeah.
And then she wasn't around for long. So,
Correct, yeah.
yeah, easy to forget which month it was she was in power. But yes, so yeah, he had these. He put these 5 pledges. We discussed them in the last episode. Things like a lot of them were things we considered not really within his power. Like this is similar to how we've touched on this before with American elections. Often people will vote on the economy, and the president actually doesn't control the economy. Like there are some effects policy can have, but he can't wave a magic wand and just be like economy better now. It's not how it works. But people will go, oh, the economy is bad, therefore president bad. And in a similar way, inflation was high. It's dropped off a bit. I mean, he said he was going to halve it, I think was what he said. Halve the rate of inflation, but not actually, reduce prices, which is 2 different things.
Yeah.
To be fair, we don't actually want negative inflation as a general rule. But my point being, the thing he said sounded quite easy, but not something he can actively control because he doesn't control the Bank of England directly.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that is held up, isn't it? That they've got that inflation has gone down, but he's not necessarily responsible for that. He's really hoped that things have gone away, and I would say that they haven't. There's a point that we were talking. Maybe one thing that has gone away to a slight degree is our last point there on the list, which is about how Rishi Sunak dealt with strikes. I felt that at the end of last year,
it was all strikes all the time.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah. And you thought, oh, is the country going to grind to a halt? It didn't, but I don't know if that was because the government took really strong action on it. I felt like they were talking a big game, but in the end that they ended up doing what you do with most strikers, which is meeting with them and negotiating with them like adults and coming to some sort of arrangement. And in a lot of those cases, those fears of strikes or them, they've simmered down a little bit. Not fully. I mean, where I work, we had a junior doctors strike just before Christmas, which in terms of impact is huge for the NHS at that time. You were dealing with a lot of winter pressure, a lot of staff shortages. People are getting ready to, sort of wind down for Christmas in a lot of areas of work. I know the NHS isn't a place that really winds down at all, but it would have caused a lot of people an awful lot of headaches having to deal with a strike there. And that's why they decided to strike then, right? Mm-hmm. You strike where you think it's going to cause the most hassle. So there's clearly issues there within the NHS, which is going to be a huge thing people are going to talk out come the general election. That was one of his pledges, to get NHS waiting lists down, and he can't do it if he hasn't got enough staff there to support it. So I think Rishi Sunak hasn't dealt with those strikes as well as possible, but they haven't quite become the huge headline-dominating issue that I thought they would. But maybe that was a bit of recency bias on the part of me, that it was just, there were a lot of strikes towards the end of 2020.
There were a lot of strikes going on, and also you look back to previous Conservative government, like that was a big thing under Thatcher, and you could see it kind of going the same way, and you're like, oh, a lot of things have recycled now, 30, 40 years on. And it wasn't a terrible guess, I don't think, to suspect that maybe they would continue. The other thing, there were still some train strikes in December, so they haven't solved everything. But it does sound like a lot of the kind of big thing, like, replacing people, because they had this plan of replacing, having less guards and stuff at stations and just being like, it'll all be automated ticketing systems. And actually the thing that kind of unraveled that, I don't think was necessarily the strikes, but when all the disabled campaigners were like, well, I need someone to get me on the train. And like the ramps are available at stations, and someone has to know there's a disabled passenger coming on the train. Like they'll tell the guard raises, that doesn't work automatically. At the very least, there needs to be someone at the, with our current rolling stock, we don't have trains. Like buses have these things where they kind of lower down and they can roll out a little ramp. Trains don't do that. And also there's a whole load of stuff about how our trains platforms are weird heights and stuff across the country. It's not an easy fix, but also it's not going to fix overnight unless you suddenly buy a load of new rolling stock, which is also expensive. So not surprising that hasn't been fixed. And they basically had to roll back, because when people started campaigning, go, look, you're just going to stop a large percentage of a decent percentage of the population from being able to access, people in wheelchairs, people limited mobility, who are getting trains, and also often in that situation can't drive a car because of those situations. They have to take the train. It's not like they have a choice. That was a lot of things haven't gone away. I think it's fair to say. He kind of didn't really deal with stuff. So I guess our final point there was that we said Rishi would be kind of propping up the support for the Conservative Party that it had, which was not high, but not really winning anyone back. And I feel like that's mostly held. You may have more detail you want to
Yeah,
sprinkle in?
and maybe we'll do more in like our predictions for what will happen in the next year. But I think he has been able to get the Conservatives back to a polling level that is higher than Liz Truss, but significantly lower than Boris Johnson. Liz Truss was certainly the nadir of Conservative support, where it was hovering around about 12-13%, and I think he's got it back to about like 22-25, maybe.
Yeah.
But
at least she wasn't the Nadine.
Yeah, precisely. But in terms of, has he then, that bounce was pretty much the moment that he came into power and stabilized things. Has he made things significantly go up or down? No, not really. And the fact that he's been able to make such little headway, given an entire year in power, is worrying. If we want to reflect on, I know that we're sort of reflecting on our predictions, but if you want to reflect on the year that Rishi Sunak has had, it's been fairly disappointing, I think, if he was going to, hold it up. We talked about how, he compares himself to the 5 pledges and how little of those that he's achieved. When he was sold as the new Conservative Party leader, one of his strengths was meant to be, well, he's not a big campaigner like Boris. He's not a huge ideas person like Liz Truss. He hasn't got this one big vision. Liz Truss had a big vision and it crashed and burned within a few weeks of her being in charge. The thing that Rishi did was he was an autocrat. He gets things done. He knows how the system works. He can steer this Conservative Party through. And all of those big promises that Boris Johnson said and never delivered on, he'll be the one to push them over the line. Where in reality, the Conservative government has stuttered and stumbled along and is still somewhat at odds at itself, even over some of its key pledges. Our entire last episode was on the debacle about Rwanda, and the fact that we're even having episodes about questioning whether a Conservative Party that had a majority of over 70 might get legislation passed that's from their own party. It's ridiculous, and I think it shows what a challenge it is for Rishi Sunak to govern with this Conservative Party at the moment. And that's meant to be his bread and butter. If he can't get that done, then it really undermines him as a leader.
And I think he was meant to be a safe pair of hands, as everyone says. And sure, he was safer than Liz Truss. He didn't immediately tank the economy. He righted the ship a bit and did all the things that were obvious. I think I would like to say to everyone, don't do this ridiculous plan. Put someone in as Chancellor who's vaguely sensible and it will be fine. But as you say, fixing things. And then like we discussed last time, the Rwanda plan seems like he wants a win, but it seems very odd to us that that's the win he's going for, because I don't think most of the public want that. And we touched on that last time. We went into more depth, so listen to the last episode, I guess, but maybe you have a point to make there.
Well, no, I think the Rwanda plan is bizarre. I think if you're going to look back, I'm going to take a long look back at 13 years of Conservative government, it's probably been quite a frustrating time for those Conservatives in power, because nearly every time they've had had their hands on the rein, right, we're ready to enforce conservatism, there's been a big asterisk stopping them. So
an asterisk, not an asterisk.
Well, and an obelisk, yeah. A big sort of mark against them that says, so for Cameron, 2010, he said, I want to be Conservative, but I'm in coalition, so I can't be fully Conservative because I've got to keep the Lib Dems happy. 2015, he finally won a majority, but then you have Brexit a year later. That throws everything into disarray. Theresa May's premiership is dominated by Brexit. It's the reason this podcast exists, and that was pretty much legislative gridlock because you couldn't get anything through until you'd sorted Brexit out. Boris Johnson comes in, sorts Brexit out, COVID immediately happens. So all of those big plans for Boris Johnson put on hold because you've got to deal with this huge crisis. Right, okay. Now Boris is gone, Liz Truss comes in. Effectively, you could say that she was the first Conservative leader who didn't have anything else on her plate, but then she decided to make a rod for her own back and suddenly tank the economy, so she had to go. Rishi Sunak is now in the time where you could go, yeah, okay, you don't have any of these big things. COVID is over. Brexit is meant to be done. Off you go. You're not in coalition. You have a huge majority. None of the caveats that apply to any of those Conservative leaders apply to you. Go ahead. The problem the Conservatives seem to have now is that all of those crises has caused a variety of factions and frictions in the party where they're not entirely split, but enough of them are split to cause a huge problem. That's kind of what the Rwanda stuff was about. And I think it's a really big reason why Rishi Sunak can't get an effective coalition within his own party to push these big policies through, because he's struggling to find the support not only amongst the wider electorate, but within his own party as well.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that. Moving on to Labour, our predictions last year. Our first one was, again, we always like to have a lowball one where we feel pretty confident. So Keir still in charge.
Yeah, I think it's it's important to sort of, the main reason I think we said that last year is because, we've been through so many Conservative leaders in quite a short period of time. Keir has been there ever since Corbyn stepped down after the 2019 election, and he looks pretty solid in place. Now, I can't think of, there were times in 2022 maybe where we thought all support might be wavering, or if something went wrong or enough people went against him that a new figure might emerge from the party. I don't think there's been any whisperings this year of a coup or somebody from the backbenches being really upset. We might talk about it later. Like, there was the one big issue I feel that he's had was on Gaza and the split between the ceasefire. But that still failed to make a significant bid in his leadership. And I think that was effectively the people who were against it didn't sort of like list Keir Starmer as their main reason for why they were voting against it. It was the very issue of like, me and my constituents vehemently believe in a ceasefire. Therefore, I'm sorry, Keir, but I have to vote against you this time. Nothing against you personally, but this is, I have to vote with my heart, which is, I think the only big thing that's happened where there's been a split in that party, but it's not necessarily been on a leadership issue. So, yeah, Keir still in charge, and I can't foresee, unless anything drastic happens, of course, which we'll have to have that caveat. He'll still be leader going into next year and into the next general election.
Yeah, I think one of the other reasons we probably put it on there, not just because of the Conservatives having all their wobbles, is if you were going to change your leader ahead of a general election, that was kind of early 2023 was probably the very last time you could reasonably switch over and have time to build up momentum behind someone else. But as we say, he's been ahead in the polls, and I think a lot of commentators have noted that his confidence has massively improved. Like, he's always been someone who's fine at, he's always been able to talk about things that he knew about, and he had this record of being a lawyer and stuff that he could pull back on, which was very useful against Boris. But actually, his kind of early PMQs against Rishi didn't seem particularly good. Now he's ahead in the polls. It does feel like every PMQs, he's just, he's pointing out all the things that are wrong with the Conservative Party. It's not hard. And he just seems like he's constantly on a winner. And then that obviously means the whole party's behind him, because, like, why would you switch at this point?
No, totally agree with that.
We said from the polls point of view, specifically, so as we said, Labour has a significant lead. We felt that if the Conservatives did well, they could maybe narrow things. Like, if Sunak had lived up to the promises he'd said, he probably could win back some of those Conservative voters and narrow it. But unless there was a major scandal for Labour, not much worry. I think that's mostly held as well. There's been a few wibbles in the polls that we've discussed, but
I don't think there's been any. You sort of like think back over the year and big scandals that happen in government, they are nearly all from the Conservative side. I mean, we don't have it on here, but like if you compare Labour's fortunes to that of the SNP this year, for example. So the SNP were solidly in power, but then had some, one, a leadership change, two, actual police investigations into money scandals and where's the money gone, stuff like that. That's having a huge effect on their support. So it does show that there are things that can happen, whether you are in or out of power, that can drastically affect your poll ratings that come out of nowhere. For Labour, they've gone away pretty scot-free, and nearly all the attention, all the gaffes have come from the Conservative side. I'm trying to think of some could argue that Keir is now playing it too safe, or where he's trying to stretch his support base. So I hope you, as many other good listeners have listened to many of the yearly reviews that Ian Hislop does when he sort of does his rounds to promote the Private Eye annual. He was talking about Keir Starmer, and the anecdote he had was about, he's gone so far now that he's praising Margaret Thatcher. We talked about that last time. Like, that is how far that, like, if you're thinking about what you've got to do as a Labour leader, it's like, okay, I've got to shore up my core vote. Like we're talking about the Conservatives having 20% of the support. They'll probably never go lower than that, maybe 12% with Liz Truss. But that's as low as you can go. There's always be a steady amount of people who will always vote Conservative, and the same is true for Labour. They've probably got a core base of 20, 25%, whatever. He's managing to keep it at 40. So he goes, okay, I've got these people on the left's support and these. I've effectively been able to distance myself from the Corbynistas within my party. Like that faction doesn't seem to exist anymore. And as an attacking point from Rishi Sunak, like Rishi Sunak often said, like, that's the man who worked under Jeremy Corbyn. It's not having the same impact anymore because Jeremy Corbyn, he can say, like, look, I've expelled him from the party. He's not even in Labour. It will, of course, upset those who were very loyal fans of Corbyn, but it's not having an effect in the polls. So where do you go if you want to kind of increase your lead? You've got to go more and more towards the centre and the centre right. So him sort of coming out and say that I didn't agree with Margaret Thatcher's politics, but you have to agree that, you know, she was a woman who did a lot of things in British politics and certainly had something she stood for. He doesn't really care that he's upsetting those on the left who hate Margaret Thatcher. He wants to get those people who say, oh, that's a reasonable thing for the centre-leaning Keir Starmer to say. Maybe I will give him my vote because I'm really upset with the Conservatives. That is how far he is leaning right, and he doesn't necessarily... I don't want to say that he doesn't care about his base, but he understands that he's probably got their vote anyway. So now he needs to try and get the vote from somewhere else. You can overreach if all of a sudden, you know, he starts saying
I love Thatcher,
yeah,
Thatcher till I die.
Yeah. Oh, and I love
Maggie,
David Cameron. Yeah. And all of my policies I'm going to steal from the Conservatives. Like that would start to lose in votes because people say, well, why would I vote Labour? Yeah, there has to be a difference between the parties. But I think it really shows that, yeah, he is firmly, he has done the opposite of what Jeremy Corbyn did. He has placed himself firmly within the centre ground of British politics. It is working. He doesn't want to change course now. And
there's also a point where you're in the lead up to a general election and you want to, like you say, there's a level of, there's stuff you can say, like the thing about Thatcher, where you can say it. Probably the people who actually are going to vote Labour are going to actually look at the manifesto and care about the actual detail that's coming out in that. They're not going to particularly remember that speech in a year's time or half a year's time. When it comes to actually voting, they're probably not going to remember that speech. They're going to be like, oh no, you know, he's Labour, he's not the Conservatives. Most people who are kind of on that left side are like, well, they were either voting Labour already, or if they maybe voted Lib Dem for a bit, they're like, well, there's two choices, and the choices are the Conservatives who've been here for 13 years, or so yeah, they're pretty much won over. Trying to sit there in the centre and say something kind of vaguely centre, like I'm sure off the top of my head, I don't have anything to hand. I wasn't alive. I was alive during Thatcher's reign, but I wasn't aware of things. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are bits where, you know, she did a vaguely sensible thing because politicians have to do vaguely sensible things to be around for a long period of time. So I'm sure there are some things you can point to. Like, look, you know, look, we can take lessons with it. And I think that is actually kind of a reasonable thing to do in politics. Say, look, X, Y, and Z is sensible, and we wouldn't rock the boat on that, or we wouldn't change that for the point of change's sake. You don't want every 5 years the direction of the country to completely pinwheel to the other side. And you see that with the kind of discussions around stuff like HS2 and stuff, where you know, Labour will say, oh, well, you know, we probably won't actually bother to change this thing now it's happened, and we'll just let it go as it is.
Yeah.
And that's because why lose votes over that? That doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be stuff in their manifesto that's more interesting, and we'll wait to see for that to come out, because I'm sure there probably will be more stuff in the manifesto. Like, I would imagine the manifesto, I would hope, is slightly more leftward than the way he's talking in speeches.
Yeah.
But the manifesto is very much for, you know, the average person can read it. The average person doesn't read it.
If you wanted to compare those like manifestos, like what Keir's manifesto is likely to be next to Jeremy Corbyn, or the fights that they had, one of the reasons that Jeremy Corbyn did so well against Theresa May is that his manifesto was, let's try new ideas, let's try different things, because that was the only option available to Labour. If they said we're going to do exactly the same as the Conservatives, nobody would vote for them. But now the Conservatives have lost trust on a lot of key issues, in particular the economy. Labour can come in now and say, like, well, we're not going to have to revolutionise the entire economy and, you know, nationalise everything to make sure it's fair. We'll keep it roughly the same, but we'll do it better. Here's our few small tweaks to make sure it's there.
Better and less corrupt.
Yeah, better and less corrupt. And then that is, for most people who are in the centre of politics, that's enough to sway them to that side. Whereas, as we saw with Corbyn to an effect, maybe some of them were put off or suddenly thought, oh no, that's too radical a change for me. I will either not vote, or I will stay Conservative, or whatever. But you saw the results in 2019; they were quite clear with how the other party went based on that second.
So our next Labour prediction was that we would expect Labour to win most of the by-elections it was in. I think by most means more than half, right?
Yeah.
So I think by that metric, definitely correct. But there were also some interesting Lib Dem wins out there.
Yeah, there were. I think the one that stuck in my mind for this is that Labour had by-elections in the past, and we may have talked on previous podcasts about how straight after 2019 there was a by-election in a red wall seat. Labour lost that. Usually sitting election. It's usually sitting governments that have been in charge for 10 years lose by-elections. Boris Johnson was winning them. That was super bad for Keir Starmer. This time they are winning really big in very, very conservative constituencies. Now the Conservatives have served up some incredible scandals and mismanagement on their part to sort of gift these by-election seats to be like, oh, you want the perfect place to have a protest vote about not only the Conservative Party, but this particular MP who did bad sex scandal, bad finance scandal, bad not turning up to Parliament and writing a book scandal, those type of things. Okay. The one I really wanted to point out here is where I think that Labour have overperformed was that Mid-Bedfordshire one with Nadine Dorries, because that was a seat that they looked as if they would have a real fight on their hands between the Lib Dems. I looked at that instantly and thought, oh, that's probably more Lib Dem territory than Labour. And I did wonder at the start if Labour would stand aside to make sure the Lib Dems took it. But no, Labour fought it tooth and nail. The votes in the end were split pretty like a third, but Labour were able to bring that over the line and make sure that Mid-Bedfordshire had its first Labour MP since 1920, 30 something. It was a very, very long time indeed. So it's results like that, by-elections aren't elections. The general public and how they vote is very different to how one small subset of people vote in a local by-election. The result there was incredible for Labour, and they'll take a lot of heart from that they can take a lot of seats that I don't think they would be expected to take. Maybe the one they'll feel disappointed about is that they didn't take Boris Johnson's old constituency, which some may have seen as very easy. Personally, I think that is a seat where I'm gonna generalize massively here, where the internet or people who look at sort of numbers go, well, it's in London. Labour should be winning that. They've got Sadiq Khan in charge. The Conservatives don't do very well in London. It's really easy to protest Boris Johnson. Why wouldn't they? They actually live in an incredibly conservative part of London, and that twinned with the ULEZ scheme that people wanted to protest meant that in the end they were unsuccessful. Now, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world for Labour, but it would have been, if Labour would have been able to take Boris Johnson's old seat, you bet they would be talking about that for a long time. They would have gone out of that saying, well, maybe we could have taken it in the 2024 general election, because that's how good we were. So, yeah, very good performance from Labour this year.
And then our final point we made, I feel this may have been, I'm not sure if this was a specific prediction, judging by the wording of it, maybe it was more of a comment. We said it was an important year for Keir, and as long as he had no gaffes and played it safe, it'd be good for him. So I guess in general that has held. Like we said, the only real wibble was around Gaza.
Yeah.
And as you said that earlier already, that wasn't really to do with him.
Yes, it wasn't to do with him, but I think when I said it was an important year, there were clear signs from the Labour Party conference in 2022, the one where Liz Truss was at the other side, where Labour for the first time really appeared like a government in waiting. And as soon as you are in that position, both in like the media's eye, the public eye, in your international sort of other leaders' eyes, you have to make sure that you're really responsible, and you can't do the politics of protest, or you can't do the jazzy things. You have to be like, okay, treat 2023 as Labour's first year in government. We don't have any actual power, but we have to do all the sensible things that the actual Prime Minister would do, right?
Yeah.
And when it relates to stuff like Gaza, in that vote on Gaza, where it was the debate whether there should be a ceasefire or not, Keir Starmer chose to do what a Prime Minister would do, who is a member of NATO and has historic ties with Israel, all of that, and say, no, we can't call for a ceasefire because I have to do what the Prime Minister would do and what international sort of expectation requires me to do. Whereas if he'd been entirely in opposition and people didn't see us in the government and waiting, of course he would have called for a ceasefire, because it's the politically expedient thing to do. You look at the opinion polls and you go, oh, more people are for a ceasefire. Yeah, I can get a cheap win out of that. It wasn't a cheap win for Keir Starmer. If anything, it caused frictions within his party. That was bad. But he did it because it was the thing a prime minister would do. That's why it was such an important year. And that's what I think he is doing really well at being that. Even sometimes in prime minister's questions, he tries to present himself as the grown-up in the room. We talked about it with the Elgin Marbles debate. They had the Prime Minister of Greece. He met with the Prime Minister of the Greece and didn't embarrass himself like Rishi Sunak. It's him just sort of saying, like, look, I'm here, I'm ready, I'm really ready to be your leader, and these are my little tests, and I hope that you think I'm passing each one. And to me, anyway, I think he's doing a good job of appearing prime ministerial before he's even in that position.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree. I think really the only thing where there was maybe a bit of discussion, as we say, was around Gaza, where some people were like, oh, yeah, maybe, but like it was more kind of, it wasn't the MPs themselves. It was maybe a few people kind of talking about the news, being like, oh, a bad week for Keir Starmer. But he hasn't really had many bad weeks in 2023. So moving on to the Lib Dems. Our first, as we say, we like a lowball one here to start. Lib Dems still cringe. The word cringe may have gone slightly out of, dating ourselves slightly there by using that word at the end of 2022. But
I'd like to say that I'm wrong on that. I'm trying to think back over the year 2023. I can't think of a notable, let's pop a big yellow balloon, let's smash through a big blue wall event that happened in 2023, unless you can think of one and prove me wrong.
Were all of the blue wall events in 2022 then? Because wasn't there one with a digger, or was that still?
Oh, okay. We have access to the internet. Let's just quickly look at this.
I'm just going to Google Lib Dem cringe 2023 and see what happens.
I'm going to do Lib Dem digger. Oh, that was a local. You know what? Here we go. March 29th, 2023, Liberal Democrats launch local election campaign with bizarre JCB video where Ed Davey drives a JCB through hay bales, some of which have been spray painted blue on one of their 6 sides. It's a cuboid. Gets out and says, the Liberal Democrats are winning here and we're smashing the blue wall. So, yeah, okay, yeah, no, I take... Just because I didn't remember it didn't mean it was happened. Somewhere there is always a Lib Dem constructing a blue wall out of inappropriate material and smashing through it, ready to post on Twitter, X, wherever you want to remind you that they're there. So, yeah, lovely.
Maybe slightly less cringe than 2022, like a change, but yes, I still think they're doing some daft stuff because it gets some headlines to an extent. Our actual prediction was they were likely to struggle in the red wall seats but do well in the rural places. I don't know exactly how the split works there with what happened this year.
I think most of our elections did happen within rural constituencies. I remember that there was one up north that the Lib Dems didn't even, they came 4th or 5th, which is, I reckon, they've done, again, by-elections are kind of Lib Dems bread and butter. That's where they aim for. I was surprised that they didn't do better in Mid-Bedfordshire than they did, but I think that's just because Labour ran a particularly strong campaign, and maybe the fact that the seat had been purely Conservative for so long really played into their hands, as in you get some more rural constituencies that historically flip-flop between the Conservatives and Lib Dems. For example, there was a by-election in Somerton Froome, which is nearby to me. That's a rural constituency. Before they had gone Conservative in the sort of 2015, 2019 election, that had been solidly held by a Lib Dem who'd been there for years and years and years and years and years. And you look at it and you go, oh yeah, no, that's a classic, won the seat in 97 Lib Dem and stayed there for over a decade, established those Lib Dem roots. That's what they like to do, and then lost it to a Conservative. When you've got a good Lib Dem in recent memory, I think it's far easier for people to go, oh yeah, no, they were here before. They're winning here. Leaflets make sense, and I can track them against actual data. They've done really well there. So I think Mid-Bedfordshire was a slight outlier. So I think that prediction still holds up. They'll be a little bit disappointed about that. The Lib Dems might think that they could have had a slightly better year, but I think you can only have one party winning these seats, right? And this is always the thing when you've got Lib Dems, Labour and Conservatives, is you tend to have 2 parties against the Conservatives most of the time. The Conservatives are on the defensive nearly everywhere. I can't think of many Labour Lib Dem marginals that exist off the top of my head. If any listeners do, and they can give me a list of 50, then sure, I'm sure they do exist. But when we're talking about big by-election results, that's where they're going to be aiming for. So, not a bad year by them at all. I think Ed Davey's actually done quite a good job of establishing himself as a fairly reliable Lib Dem voice. I seem to think maybe it was just because we had so many elections between 2015 and the Lib Dems sort of got rid of leaders after each election, every time they lost. But it felt like Tim Farron wasn't leader for very long. The one before him, the lady who I've forgotten her name, Sarah somebody.
She was the one who kind of tied her mast to stopping Brexit. And therefore had to go when that didn't work. Yeah,
exactly. They had a lot of leaders before then, which didn't quite work. I mean, obviously they had Nick Clegg for a long while, who kept his position even after they were out the coalition, because I think he was seen as strong, strong leader, a well-known face. I think they've really been able to. We mentioned it last year that they've moved away from just being anti-Brexit, and they're on to kind of what I would describe as good old-fashioned Liberal Democrat policies, reminding them why they are still a significant force in British politics and why you can never sort of just discount them and say they'll go away. They'll pick up plenty of seats in 2024.
Our final point there was Ed Davey's still leader, which he is. I mean, it's not a particularly hard one, but I think you've expressed the reasons why that, if he'd had a string of terrible by-election results, then maybe 2023 would have been the time to swap for someone younger and more interesting ahead of a general election. As it is, he's done well, so he's going to be going into the general election.
Yeah.
And as I say, probably going to be a good year for them going into the general election, because they tend to win seats off Conservatives, and there's going to be a lot of Conservative seats disappearing, I would guess. So that's the Lib Dems. On to our kind of other broad topic, the one that kind of started the podcast. It's kind of winding down, but we still had some thoughts on Brexit. I think we were kind of like, do we want to continue doing prediction? Maybe this will be the last year where we have a section on Brexit.
Yeah.
So first one was, we thought the Conservatives might use Brexit to try and gain support in red wall seats. I'm not going to lie, I haven't really paid attention to their kind of local manifestos in these elections. Obviously, we've mentioned you, Les, but I don't know if that came to pass or not.
No, and I think it hasn't. So Brexit for the Conservatives is a weird topic. It's the same as it was kind of for Labour a few years ago, in my opinion. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So Keir Starmer, for a while, after he'd taken over from Jeremy Corbyn, was forced into this weird zone where he had to be, I didn't want Brexit to happen, and I campaigned very strongly on the side of Remain. And then I kind of wanted a halfway solution under Jeremy Corbyn. And now I'm definitely in support of Brexit. But we're so worried we don't have an answer that will please all our supporters. We don't want to talk about it. If anybody brings it up, it automatically put Labour on the back foot, and the Conservatives seem strong, because the Conservative position on Brexit was united. We want to get it done. Boris is going to get it done. You, Labour, are flip-flopping. You're not quite sure. Your answers seem wishy-washy. Okay? Now that the Brexit is more established, it's moving down the pecking order of where it is in the news, and I think that reflects that in general, most of the general public accept the current situation. They may not be completely comfortable. Some still might want to return to the EU. I think there's quite a few people who would like to do that, but they recognise that it's happened. We need to get over. We need to move. Get over it. Move on. Finally, after maybe nearly 10 years or 8 years, however long it's been since that referendum, that visceral kind of the reason we started the podcast, those big fights that you had in Parliament, they faded now. And it's kind of due to the part that the Conservatives are struggling, even after Brexit has happened. I'll say that it's happened in 2019 when we officially agreed the deal and we left. They don't have many positives they can talk about.
All these Brexit dividends that they kept mentioning would happen. There aren't many you can point to and say that's a real win. I think they tried to say about the vaccine rollout that was one, but I don't think many people kind of bought that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at the time, I think some people were like, oh yeah, that's useful. But I don't think many people actually bought that was really the reason it was so good.
Yeah, and even that is short term. So like a vaccine, COVID is fading into the background where it's important. So like saying it's, the only reason you got a vaccine is because because we've got Brexit, might have been important in 2021. It has far less weight going into 2020. If you're going to fight an election in 2024, talking about that, people go, yeah, really? Well, it's not currently, mate, I'm looking at my food bills going up. And, how has Brexit helped me there? That was one of the things that the advert said it would reduce, that things would get cheaper. That hasn't happened. Immigration should come down. It hasn't. It's gone up. Talk about the Rwanda plan last time. There are lots of things that people said would happen under Brexit. Reduced NHS waiting list times. Not happened either. So all of a sudden, if you bring Brexit up and the Brexit dividends, it puts the Conservatives on the back foot. So as a cultural point, you can say, and Rishi Sunak has in PMQs had a go at Keir Starmer for, I mentioned it last time, Ode to Joy being his favourite song, because that's what a European lover would do. But they're more cultural points than actually like solid points. And whenever Brexit is brought up, it's seen as a weakness. You've got people like Nigel Farage in Reform saying, yeah, he will openly admit that Brexit has been a failure. Nigel Farage will say it's because they haven't been hard enough. And if you vote for Reform, that's how you get the Brexit that you were promised, if only you'll vote me in. But the Conservatives can't do that because they're worried about the very real implications that would have for everyone. It's like the more extreme you go, the more they go, oh, that's actually unachievable. So, Brexit, although we might retire this next year as we're talking about it, I'd be really interested to see how much it's brought up in 2024. If you think it was an issue that absolutely dominated the 2019 general election, right? It was Boris Johnson's oven-ready deal. The whole reason we had that was because we couldn't get a deal through Parliament. Lots of people, I think, voted for it so they could have an end to the turmoil. So at least one party had a big majority and could make a definitive decision. Voters won't be going in with the same thing in mind. And I think we're seeing that in the red wall seats as well, where Labour are winning big. It's because Brexit is fading as an important topic and they are slowly going back to Labour. And when you look at the swing that the Conservatives have had to have and their majorities in those seats that are like 0.5, 0.1%, doesn't seem to have had the long-term effect that some of us felt it was. Like, back then, you've got idiots like me saying, this is a huge cultural change. Brexit has forever rip up everything you know about class and economy and what happens. Brexit is the new dividing line. And just sometimes these things just take time to heal. And I think it is fading more and more into the background.
You've kind of touched on the other predictions a bit there. But so our next one now is they would use it to bash Labour. I'm not sure they've really maybe they've tried, and I forgot, like in PMQs and stuff, and that, like you say, occasionally we're like, oh, well, Keir Starmer thought this. But I think the thing is, Keir Starmer has, at least as most people remember, been kind of behind. Let's get Brexit done now. Like in the 2019 election, he wasn't saying I want to stop Brexit.
No. But in the 2019 election, it was like, well, we might have another referendum to maybe see if people want it, or
that's wishy-washy enough that people will just forget it.
Yes, precisely. Or a lot of people will say, oh, well, he said it back then, but I'm actually concerned in what he's saying now. And his policy now is not that we'd have another referendum. If he came in charge, he wouldn't do that. Here is what his plan for Brexit is, or what he will do in this society. And if anything, Keir is more like, well, I think we should have a bit more cooperation between us and the EU, but as equal partners rather than us being part of them. And we can and I think that appeals to a lot of people. Even we talk about who he was appealing to before, like where he's going to the right and maybe trying to pick up Conservatives who are on the left of that party. A lot of those would have been soft Brexiteers, if not Remainers as well. And of that group of people, they're not the GB News watchers. They don't want to completely isolate themselves. They want to have a realistic trade agreement with the EU and work on a much softer Brexit. Okay, right, yeah, this has happened, but let's make it feasible, let's make it workable, and see how things go. And I think that's what Keir Starmer has done. And it doesn't rock the boat because you can talk to somebody. He can go to a red wall constituent and they say, are you going to overturn Brexit? And he can look them in the eye and say, no, not going to do that at all. But he can also turn to somebody who is a Remainer and say, look, we're stuck with this now, but I'm going to make the best of it. I'm not going to be horrible. I'm not going to isolate us from the rest of Europe. I want to do these productive things. So, yeah, that's why I think it's they can try and bash Labour with it, but it's actually a stronger point for Labour now than the Conservatives.
You also said core issues. These are kind of more statements. Yeah. We said the core issues have gone away. We've touched on that. And also that it might come up with a general election. Obviously, there wasn't a general election this year, so it didn't come up that much. But yeah, we'll keep our eyes out for it and we'll report on it, but probably not do any predictions. Yeah. So moving on to our final category, US predictions. So first one, quite an easy one. Well, I mean, he did prevaricate, but Donald Trump is going to run again, was what we said.
Yeah, I mean, and guess, boy, is he trying, despite what the courts might have to say. I listened to this earlier, so I said, yeah, I said he was going to run, but I said that was super easy as well. Like he was always going to run, no matter if he was.
He would run from a prison cell.
Yes,
right? Which
is
technically a thing you can do, as a lot of Americans are discussing right now.
Yeah, so he is going to run. I think. I mean, if you want to go on to the second point, I think that's more interesting. So
yeah, you said you think it would be bad if Trump won with lots of investigations hanging over him, essentially. And we're starting to see some of those coming through. And there's also been other stuff we hadn't foreseen. So there's been all this stuff like saying, oh, you can't vote for him in Colombia.
Yeah, it's Donald Trump is a problem. And I don't mean that just in a basic sense, as in he has lots of issues surrounding him that make him vastly more complicated than any other candidate that's been besides, and the name is escaping me now. What's the Republican House representative who had to go? Is it
George Santos?
George Santos, yeah. He's not quite George Santos level. Like George Santos had a lot of other things going, but people said he got elected and then, oh my goodness, they looked at him and everything about him was fake. You look at Donald Trump and you can say, yeah, he's got elected, but also he's going to be convicted for this, and this. And if he becomes president, will he just turn around and say, I'm president, you can't convict me? And if he does that dismantle the entirety of the US Constitution? If he's president, does that mean the Supreme Court is going to be involved every other month to get going? We talked sometimes about how leaders like Trump and Johnson almost govern through chaos, as in you seem to be moving from crisis to crisis each week, and it distracts you from the last bad thing they've done because there's another dead cat on the table. I don't think Donald Trump would be throwing these dead cats on the table on purpose. He just would have to be moving from crisis to crisis. So, yes, he can still win. I mean, we mentioned that we thought Ron DeSantis might be a better option if Republicans wanted to win. It turns out in the court of public opinion, that weren't right, was it? Ron,
that was definitely one we got wrong.
Yeah, the decline of DeSantis has been huge. But I think I still stand by the fact that even though there are some polls that say Trump is leading Biden one-on-one, you've had a couple of those polls, particularly after the way that a lot of Democrats viewed his apparent mishandling of what happened in Israel and Gaza. There were a lot of Democrats who are unhappy about him. I think that it is a temporary blip, and that if you have a look at the number of people who are undecided in those polls, those undecideds are far more likely to go to a candidate like Biden than they are to go for Trump, who has a lot of scandal. Trump clearly has a very big fan base that probably will bring him the Republican leadership. I don't think it will bring him the presidency. And the big problem the Republicans have is, well, if DeSantis, who was trying to be a mini Trump, failed so spectacularly and those people disowned him, then what happens to those supporters once Trump goes away? Who is the next heir apparent? Like, you get these little cults of personality that happen. We talk in British politics, you could say it maybe about like Nigel Farage. People, for some bizarre reason, I don't know why, they like Nigel Farage. Okay, they like Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson isn't allowed back into the Houses of Parliament anymore after what he did. And Nigel Farage is loosely affiliated with Reform, but would really struggle even for his party to win 5 seats in the next general election. So if he was, if any of these people were to completely step away from politics as a whole, where does that support go? Which one person do they rally behind? Who is the successor to Trump? That's the big question mark. He's not getting any younger. This could be, if he wins in 2024, then he can only run one more time. And you're like, that'll be his last term until he can run again. So unless he was to change the rules, that might not be above what Trump would do. But you see what I mean, where you've got this huge problem for the Republicans who are like, oh my goodness me, we need to find a way to direct these people to go into a ideology rather than a person, because otherwise they're they're going to face the same problems that Rishi Sunak has, without the sort of like, oh, I like Boris because he's Boris crowd. People like his successors just can't quite match the same level.
And then our final prediction on the US was that Biden will run again, but not Kamala.
Yeah.
So we know Biden's running again, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that's not. I think the only concern would have been if Biden had serious health wobbles in the last year. I mean, there's always the bit where, like, he stumbles up a set of stairs, but he's an old man.
Yeah,
So's Trump.
Yes.
Trump has had. Well, I mean, there's stuff now saying, pointing out where Trump may be starting to show signs of dementia and stuff. these kind of things happen a lot when there are old candidates, and both sides are obviously going to try and discredit the other. So there's probably a level of having to take a pinch of salt for all of this. But, he hasn't shown a significant, like if he was on his deathbed or otherwise significantly impaired, he would not be running again. He is running again. There's a bit of discussion about, is he going to go, how much is he going to be able to do on the campaign trail? Because last time he mostly did it from his basement because of COVID, and he seemed sensible. But, he's running again. He's the current president. He has that incumbent advantage. But yes, did we put not Kamala? When we put not Kamala, I assume we were saying she wasn't going to be the presidential candidate.
Yeah, she wasn't going to be presidential. Yeah. She wouldn't challenge unless there was a huge sort of coup against Biden that just doesn't, that wouldn't come together. You also get like Bernie Sanders was also always challenging the Democratic Party candidate and seemed to represent a wing of the Democratic Party over there that wants them to be more left-leaning. I don't think, as far as to my knowledge, I must admit I need to keep up with US politics a little bit better. To my knowledge, Bernie Sanders isn't planning another run this year. He is also very old. That is maybe the big problem that US politics has, that if it does become Biden-Trump again, you will have one extremely old man up against another extremely old man who will have to rule for another 4 years. I think when they met the first time round, it was one of the oldest fields we'd ever had. And now we're 4 years down the line again. So Barack Obama, this ain't, like a youthful, fresh-faced president coming into the role. So, tough times ahead. We'll probably talk more about US when we do our predictions.
Yeah, predictions for next year. Next episode.
Yeah, next episode.
So speaking of, so I think we did okay on our predictions. I guess maybe we were a bit
we didn't do any bombastic ones, did we? That's what I'm thinking.
Maybe we should have some risky choices.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just going to go out there and say that
in the first episode.
Rishi Sunak to become is going to get the the best speed run time for Donkey Kong. It's going to be my prediction.
Okay, cool. We'll put that one in the list.
Yeah.
So okay, we're going to move on to another episode. So we're going to wrap this episode up. Thank you as always for joining me, Rob. You can find us in all the usual places, such as on our website, parliamentary.language, a domain name I'm still surprised they let me keep. /r/unparliamentary on Reddit. You can find us on Twitter, I won't call it X, at Unparl Podcast, and on Instagram, Unparl Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on patreon.com/TTSS if you want to throw $1 our way each month in order to get some bonus content. So we normally have a bit of a chat before we record these episodes that you'll get access to, and that also applies to all the other podcasts on the networks that are recording at the moment. It's mostly on Parliamentary Language right now, but yes, when other stuff's there, or you can go back to the archives and listen to crossovers we do with Mishmash Mayhem and other things in the past. I guess other than that, there's nothing less for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Rob is eating the mic.
Bye.